in the British Neolithic. He's got a passion for research and activities that impact on the wider public, and he strongly believes that our prehistoric heritage has contemporary relevance and can benefit society. Kenny's involvement in wider public engagement is also evident on Twitter, where you may know him as the urban prehistorian. So I just want to get started tonight on tonight's talk. It's Dr. Kenny Brophy on Megalithic overkill, rethinking the multiple stone rows of Caithness and Sutherland. Over to you, Kenny.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see these slides and hear me.
Yep.
Hello? Yes? Okay, right. It's a bit strange talking to a laptop when there's so many people out there from all around the world watching this. So thanks very much for everyone coming along this evening. And if anything goes wrong with my presentation, please someone let me know, because otherwise I could just sit and talk to my laptop all evening. So I'm Kenny Brophy. I'm based at Glasgow University, and although I am now mostly known for my urban prehistory, back in the earlier part of the century, I did a lot of rural prehistory as well. And this is a relatively small project that I was involved in a few years ago, and that is something that I haven't, is a bit of a guilty secret, because I haven't actually been able to get to the point of bringing this to proper publication. But doing this has forced me into thinking about how to make that happen, and it's something I'm planning to do over the next year. And I'd also like to thank those who co-directed with me on the fieldwork in Caithness, Amelia Panetton, Andrew Baines and Steve Mills, for all of their help and input into some of the ideas that I'm going to discuss tonight. So the multiple stone rows of Caithness and Sutherland are a very strange phenomena. This picture here is of the best known of the monuments, the Hillimeny Stains, which is to the south of Wick. And as you can see on the picture, it's just a jumble of stones, but these are actually all standing stones, even though they're all quite small standing stones. And quite fancifully, back in the 1930s, Gordon Childe found the best parallel for this site to be Carnac, and that's a bit of an overblown parallel, but I think that what he was getting at was that these are sites that involve lots of rows of lots of standing stones. And really, there's very little else like that in the British Isles other than in places like Dartmoor. And you have to look to Brittany for other parallels. Now, for this evening, I'm going to cover a bit of ground, and hopefully I won't go on until 10 o'clock. I'm going to start just by introducing the monuments and some of the history of the study, which is quite pertinent to the work that I've been doing. And then I'm going to do a bit of a summary of some of the fieldwork that I undertook with colleagues in the 2000s, and also some earlier work that's relevant from Caithness. And then I'll finally conclude with my thoughts as they currently stand as to what these multiple stone rows were all about. And these are ideas I've been mulling over for quite a long time, and some of you may have heard me talk about some of these aspects of these monuments before, so apologies if you've heard some of this before, but hopefully for most of you this will be quite a fresh take on some quite weird monuments. Now, there's probably about 20 or so multiple stone row sites curiously arranged in this little northern corner of mainland Scotland. And in this rather rubbish map that I threw together very quickly for this presentation, you can see that for the most part, the monuments are distributed near water. They're either in river valleys like the Naver or the Thurso rivers, or they're on the coast, or in the case of sites around Battlemoss, where I was working south of Wick, they're next to a loch. So these are sites all have a watery connection, and they're also all on routeways as well, which probably tells us something about these locations in prehistory. And I'll come back later on to what these places would have been like when these sites were constructed. There's a few other sites that are perhaps relevant here. Halmey, which I'll talk about later on, is a very, very weird site near Dunbeath that I think has got something to tell us about what the multiple stone rows were about. And also, although I won't say much about it, Akavanish horseshoe setting is a really peculiar standing stone setting, which is actually gives another weird connection to Brittany, because the only other place you find these sorts of horseshoe settings of standing stones is Brittany. So there's a strange connection here with all of these standing stone monuments in Caithness and Sutherland are like mini versions of what you found in Brittany much earlier on in prehistory. But I think this is a coincidence. The connection ends there. So these sites have been known about since the mid-19th century. Alexander Rhine documented some when he was travelling in the area on behalf of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. But the first archaeological work that was undertaken, and perhaps the most significant up until my fieldwork, modestly, I'm saying, we have the work of Joseph Anderson, one of the great figures in the development of Scottish archaeology. And Anderson was based in Caithness in the 1860s. At the time, he was the editor of the John O'Groats Journal, and he carried out a campaign of fieldwork in a variety of monumental complexes around the area, and he carried out some very quick, rough and ready excavations of some chambered cairns and Bronze Age burial monuments and other sites around the county. And some of that formed the basis for his seminal publication, Scotland in Pagan Times, from the 1870s, which was based on his Rhine lectures from earlier that decade. And this is really the first time that there was a proper archaeological assessment of these multiple stone rows. The plan on the left of Gary Wynne in Caithness is the first ever published plan of a set of multiple stone rows, and it shows quite well the characteristics of these monuments. Essentially, a series of rows of small standing stones. The rows are not, in this case, are set almost in a fan-like arrangement, radiating out from a central point. And the rows are quite wobbly. The stones are all quite small, usually no more than knee height. And the focal point in the case of this monument is a kist burial that contained a beaker burial. And for Anderson, these were the stone rows were essentially a sort of a dressing on kists or burial monuments. He argued, essentially, he said that they were an external adjuncts of Bronze Age burial. So there was some kind of Bronze Age burial established maybe towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. And then these standing stones were added to that as a kind of as some kind of embellishment to expand the monument complex. And so he saw them as being closely associated with the burials, perhaps a founding burial in the centre of the monument. And to be honest with you, all of Anderson's thoughts on these sites, you know, are pretty much hold up today, I would say. Although there's been quite a lot of detours to get to me saying that between Anderson's work and then where we are now. There was some very high quality surveys undertaken of some of the stone rows by Henry Dryden in 1871 when he travelled around the county, and he produced these fine plans that are found in the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland archives and in the Historic Environment Scotland. And these are all really big scale plans, really painstakingly documented. And you can see in this plan of the Hilly Many Stains, all of the red blobs are essentially standing stones, and then as dots to try and join these into cohesive lines. And there's also lots of gaps, you'll notice as well, where there's no red standing stones. And this is where it was assumed that stones had either been removed or perhaps had become consumed by the vegetation or peat development, which is a major problem in trying to understand these sites. And Dryden had come fresh from a campaign of survey work in Brittany, so he was quite familiar with this style of monument, albeit on a smaller scale. The most comprehensive bit of work that was done subsequent to that was by Alexander Curll during the preparation of the Caithness and Sutherland Royal Commission inventories. And Curll carried out a remarkable series of seasons of fieldwork in 1909 to 1911, where he essentially cycled around the counties and documented as many archaeological sites as he could. He recorded quite a lot of the known multiple stone rows because Anderson had recorded 7 or 8 of the sites. But Curll also started to locate sites in Sutherland, and he was able to follow up tips from local people who had identified sites in a variety of different places, and he visited those and then documented them. And here we have a plan of a very complicated monument at Upper Dounreay, which is just to the south of the old nuclear power station. And this is a site that's got lots and lots of rows. But again, in the plan on the right here, you probably can just see there's lots and lots of little dots, almost random dots. All of those are standing stones, and some of them with the eye of faith can be arranged into lines. And notice also in this plan there's 2 hashered features which are probably cairns of some kind. So Curll did the survey work, and by that time there was probably about 17 or 18 sites documented in those 2 inventories, and Curll again believed they were Bronze Age burial monuments. Now, the story really stopped at that point. Nothing much happened. There was no archaeological engagement with these sites for a long time, and until Alexander Thom came along in the 1950s onwards, and he started a campaign of fieldwork, which was part of his broader decades-long campaign of documenting megalithic sites across Britain, Ireland and beyond. And Tom seems to have had a particular fascination with the multiple stone rows, which formed a really central part to his belief that megalithic monuments were highly accurate astronomical measuring devices. And having looked at lots of Tom's notebooks, it's quite clear that when he was visiting the multiple stone rows, that he was searching out horizon points to try and make these alignments work for him. And he was, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But eventually, I would argue he found what he was looking for, and he was able to start to come up with conclusions that related the multiple stone rows to the movements of the moon in particular. And on the left in this slide, there's a couple of pictures of Tom's amazing notebooks, which you can again look at in the reading room in HES, which have got his careful notes and all the sites, and also things like shopping lists and how many tins of beans he was going to buy. And also every notebook's got a little comment at the front that says, if you find this notebook, please return it to this address for a £10 reward. So there's a really nice record of Tom's working methodology. And he surveyed these sites on multiple occasions between 1957 and the late 70s. And these are plans that Tom published of these sites. And these are really, in a sense, define the modern view we have of these sites, where we have the stones themselves depicted on the plans, but then we have these artificial grids imposed on the top. So again, in these survey plans, the black blobs are standing stones, and the white blobs are where Tom probed with a stick or a metal surveying pin or something like that, and he found buried stones that were beneath the peat. So the site at the bottom of this slide at Camster, you'll probably agree, is quite a sorry-looking affair in terms of the number of stones that are actually visible. This site, having visited it about a decade ago, is virtually impossible to see now because the peat has encroached so much that the stones are almost all buried. I think I only found 2 or 3 of these stones. So when Tom was here in the 70s and the 60s, it was already disappearing, and he didn't really find very much, but he still managed to impose a grid onto the site. The one at Watton is maybe more informative because, again, there's not many stones there, but there seems to be a very detailed grid. And maybe if you can notice in the scale, the grid is also to a megalithic yard scale, which is the prehistoric measurement system that Tom decided was in use in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods in Europe. And what these grids are doing are that he's trying to suggest that this is how the monuments were initially laid out. So in other words, these were highly accurate sites where all the stones were all exactly the same distance apart, were arranged in perfectly straight lines and had this grid-like formation. And you might be able to see from looking at this plan that a lot of the stones don't actually sit on the grids. They're missing the corners, they're missing the lines. They're just not, the rows are wobbly, and we've seen that in plans already. And so Tom argued that this was because the stones had moved since they were erected in prehistory. His argument being that they were actually not set in very deeply because they were small standing stones. And so the actions of erosion and soil creep and frost and so on had actually moved the stones about, and they were no longer in their original positions. And his grids were showing how the monuments initially looked, which is a push, I would say, but nonetheless, that was what Tom believed. And his theory, rather incredibly, was that these sites were what he called lunar extrapolation sites, which essentially were used to, first of all, inform people in prehistory of the exact positions on the horizon line of the lunar standstills, which are part of the lunar cycle, but also they were used to predict eclipses, according to Tom. And so Aubrey Burrow, who has written about stone rows extensively, tried to explain what Tom's theory about these rows was all about. So he said the fan at the Hillymeni was constructed as a template in which a person could move amongst the stones like a knight on a chessboard, forwards and sideways to a calculatable backsite for a lunar event he could not see. And this sort of sums up. This is a really extremely weird theory that Tom developed over these decades of work, where these monuments were constructed to allow people to move around on the ground and then to position themselves to line up their view in the correct direction to see these lunar standstill events and predict eclipses. And this might sound fanciful, but if we actually look at the way this site was presented to the public up until about 2010, this perspective that these monuments had this incredible lunar measurement element to them was actually documented on the Historic Scotland notice board, because Hillymeni is a guardianship site. And so this notice board, up until 2010, says considerable time, effort, and organisation must have been expended by the community to create this device, which is probably used to organise the farming cycle. And this might be the only time ever that Historic Scotland have called a prehistoric monument a device. But that was the authoritative government position that was presented to visitors to that site up until 2010-11. So Tom's theories were incredibly pervasive. And not much happened archaeologically after Tom did this work. Leslie Myatt, who's a local amateur archaeologist, did some really fantastic work in the 80s and 90s in particular. He went around and found some more unidentified sites, including one at Skelpick that he found and was weirdly destroyed by the farmer a few years later through a ploughing incident. And Myatt expanded the distribution of some of the sites to the Sutherland Straths. And he also published a series of really useful articles in the Caithness Field Club Bulletin, which had diagrams like the one on the right here, which essentially are trying to explain what on earth Tom's theories were and how these monuments might have looked had they been in their original form and the stones hadn't moved around. And the pattern really continued with the ongoing analysis that was always about survey work, because Myatt found these sites, he surveyed them. Tom was always surveying the sites. Currell surveyed the sites. And this was followed up by a campaign of survey work by Roger Mercer and Edinburgh University in the 70s and 80s, where they published 4 volumes of survey results based on Northern Scotland work they did. And this includes some really fantastic plans of some multiple stone rows, especially in the Yarrows landscape. And here you can see the bigger plan in the bottom right of the slide is of Upper Dounreay, which is the site that I showed a plan a few minutes ago by Currell. And this site is bereft of any kind of grid, because basically even Tom couldn't make a grid fit this site. And you can see actually looking at this monument with all these little dots on the plan, which are standing stones. This is a completely random collection of standing stones. It's very difficult to see any kind of pattern in. And this is partly just because the stones are disappearing beneath the peat. There's even less of it visible now than when Currell surveyed it. I've been here a few times and it's very difficult to find any more than a handful of stones. So these sites, when they don't have grids on them, don't quite look as organised as Tom had initially argued. So up until about the 1990s, really 2000, apart from some poking about that Anderson did, which we'll come back to in a few minutes, all that had ever been done on these monuments was survey work, and they'd been surveyed to death essentially. And some sites had been surveyed 5, 6, 7, 8 times. But I would argue that that didn't actually bring us any closer to understanding when these sites were built or what they were meant to be used for. And this always really bugged me when I was a student, and I did some field work I excavated at Halmy in the early 1990s, and I'll come back to Halmy later. And when I was there, I visited a lot of these sites, and I was perplexed as to the lack of archaeological engagement with these sites other than survey work. And also the fact that Tom's lunar extrapolation theory seemed to be the only show in town in terms of understanding what these sites were all about. So in 2003, myself and colleagues, Amelia and Andrew and Steve, started to do some work at Battle Moss, which is a set of stone rows on the east side of the Loch of Yarrows in a very rich prehistoric landscape. This site was surveyed by Henry Dryden in 1871. You can see in the left, hopefully, Dryden's plan, which shows a cluster of 8 or so rows with lots and lots of stones, and then one row that kind of drifts off to the north in a very kind of windy fashion. I was never very convinced as being anything other than maybe a field boundary that he mistook for being a prehistoric stone row. Now, Anderson in 1865 claims that he did do some excavation at this site at different parts of the lines at Battle Moss, but it failed to yield any evidence of any associated interments. Now, this is the only mention that I can find anywhere of this excavation, and there's no archive whatsoever associated with it or any imagery. But what essentially Anderson was testing the idea that these standing stones were gravestones, which was something that was documented in folklore about these sites locally. And he obviously dug some holes between the stones and found nothing and concluded they weren't gravestones, which then informed his theory they were additions to graves. And then this is, I think this is a Mercer's plan of Battle Moss. And towards the end, at the end of the kind of weird extra row that Dryden had identified, we found a possible cairn, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So this is a site that had been surveyed a lot. So these are the sites in this little table here, and everyone who surveyed the site roughly agreed that there was probably about 8 rows, but maybe we thought in some places there might only be 6 rows, others thought 7. Mercer thought there might have been 9 rows. And the number of stones varied between different plans as well. And as you can see in the top plan here, this is the plan that was drawn by Alexander Thom. And again, you've got these stones, the little black lines are the stones. You've got the grid overlying that. And you may notice that the stones are almost not lying on the grid at all. Very few of them lie on the corner points on the grid where they should. And so Thom saw this as a site that was very, very slippery. The stones had really moved about a lot since prehistory. And all of the stones were 2.5 megalithic yards apart. And this was a site that he tried to make into a fan, even though it's essentially a set of parallel lines. But it suited his purposes to make it into a fan. But the axial point of the fan was about 2 kilometres away from the monument because the stones are so closely aligned to each other. So this is the site as it looked when Mercer was surveying it in the early 1980s. And those of you who are really eagle-eyed might see in the top left of that picture, there's a long white building, and that's where we actually stayed during the excavation. And occasionally actually crossed the loch by boat to start the digging, which is a very grand way to start any excavation. And so you can see here that, again, these stones are very small. This really emphasises the fact that this is not Karnak. These are all very small stones that, to be honest with you, once the grass grows a bit, they're quite easy to trip and fall over. But here the grass had been cleared and you could at least see the tops of them sticking out of the ground. And here's an aerial photograph taken of the area before we did the excavation. And it's very difficult to see much detail here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but the stone rows are in this area here. This is where we identified a cairn during just a walkover ahead of the excavation. And we have this boundary between unimproved and improved land. And that's where the weird long extra row that Dryden identified ran, although no traces are survive of it now. And this is all just moorland, completely heather moorland, although some of the monument does survive in that area as well. We carried out a ground penetrating radar survey in 2003 to decide if the monument extended beyond the visible size of the monument, and we didn't find anything on either side. So we think that probably the monument that is visible just now is as much you can see. And we also did a lot of survey work, and eventually the late Paul Humphreys produced this very nice plane table survey, which we would like to say is a kind of definitive plan of the monument, which shows that some of the rows continued beneath the fence line, which had never previously been recorded, and the rows are very wobbly. The stones are not aligned with one another. They're roughly parallel, but you can see that some of the lines curve and wander. Some of the rows start to disappear. So row, one of the rows, D, is sort of very difficult to find anywhere other than the middle. H is a short row. So we tried to number the rows and number the stones to help us during the excavation, and it actually just caused huge amounts of complexity, and they were very complicated. And it just showed that this is a very confusing monument. It's not built to a geometrical logic that we would understand. Now, we excavated the site again in 2003, and we identified a whole range of stones that were still in situ in their slots. And this is a nice photo from the dig back then. And the key thing to really recognise here is that all of the stones are exactly where they were put in prehistory. They haven't moved at all. So Tom's theory that these stones crept around with the soil can be disproved. These were set within a kind of a boulder clay, a podzolized soil, and each of the standing stones was jammed into space with some very tightly spaced packing stones. The stone sockets, the holes themselves were not very big, and the stones were probably just slightly smaller than the holes, and then small flat slabs were jammed in on either side, and there was virtually nothing in any of the stone holes. So they're very, very simple construction, but the key thing is the monument hasn't moved since prehistory. And in fact, there's almost a kind of weird, unexpected logic about the way this monument is organised. Because it seems that, in fact, the stones were located with a degree of deliberateness that is belied by the kind of the random wobbliness of the plans. One of the stone sockets we found, for stone A19, which is somewhere on the west side of the monument. This here we found that the stone hole had been battered through the bedrock, which suggested that the stone had to be placed in this location, because if they just dug the hole another 15-20 centimeters to the south or the north even, they would have not had to bother bashing through the bedrock. So I think that there's probably something going on here with them actually having to place the stones in exactly these places. So there's a deliberate sense that these stones are being placed with, but also they're not being placed in an order that's obvious to us. It's not a geometrical order. There's something else going on. The cuckoo clock I can just hear there. One other thing that that's worth noting is that we found no artifacts at all on this excavation. We found nothing that was datable, and anyone who knows me will know that's pretty much dogged my whole career for excavations, unfortunately. But anyway, that was cheap in terms of the post-excavation work. But we don't have any dates for the monument. But I'll come back later on to when I think that these sites were constructed. Now, the cairn itself we excavated in 2003, 2005, and it looks like it was a two-phase Bronze Age cairn. The first phase being some kind of beaker-associated monument, and then that being converted into something that was almost like a clava cairn with a big kerb around it and associated with a cremation burial and cremation urn. And the cremated human remains dated to around 1700 to 1800 Cal BC. So this is a monument of very much of the Bronze Age, and it doesn't seem to be a coincidence it's located in a place that is aligned on by the stone rows. So there's clearly a connection there, and I'll come back to that. So as part of the project, we also wanted to spend a bit of time exploring the other monuments in the counties. And these are little visited sites, and some of them were very, very difficult to find. And again, this is because these are such tiny stones in a way that if the vegetation's high, then you're not going to see them. So we had to visit them in times of the year when the weather is fairly poor in these areas, but the midges weren't around very much, which was great. And so we have here Andrew Baines documenting the very, very kind of remote sites at Loch Baddenloch and Kinbrace, and also Borlam and Caithness, a site where the stones are literally lost in gorse bushes and almost impossible to find. So these are sites that are challenging to understand and interpret, and even to find in the landscape. But we visited all of them, and it allowed us to draw some conclusions about what we thought was these monuments were, what role they were serving within prehistory. There's a few sites that unfortunately have been lost in time. This is a site that was documented by Currow in the Strath of Kildonan in Sutherland, which is called Altbreck, which is quite near Kilfedder Broch, for those of you who know that site. And this is a site where Currow documented quite a lot of rows, as you can see in the picture. There's lots of rows of little standing stones, and again, this is related to a cairn which is slightly uphill from it. Unfortunately, sometime after the inventory was created, the public road there was expanded and a passing place was added, and the stone row was literally destroyed, and all the stones were just thrown away or used as part of the building material for the road. So that site is now lost, unfortunately. So there were more sites, and I'm sure, given the scale of these sites and where they are located in the landscape, that there are lots more out there waiting to be found. And one of the most stunning sites, and again, little visited, I think, is Learable Hill in Sutherland, which is further up the Strath of Kildonan. And this is a really incredible site that's worth checking out if you get a chance to go on to Canmore, where there's 4 sets of standing rows, there's standing stones, but there's also a really big concentration of later prehistoric settlement traces as well, in terms of clearance cairns and field systems and some hut circles and things like that, which starts to give us a sense that these stone rows are maybe not quite as remote as they might appear in the landscape, and they actually are in places that were clearly being farmed in later prehistory. And that's a theme I'll return to in a little while. So this process took a few years of visiting all the sites, doing the excavations and so on. And then really, I guess at that point, things went into a bit of abeyance in terms of my focus, because I started to become embroiled in really big projects that took up a lot of my time. But when I started to come back and think about this again a few years later, I realised that there was another site that I'd been involved in that perhaps surprisingly shed some kind of light on what was going on with the stone rows. This is a site that maybe is mythical or legendary within Scottish archaeology, called Halmy in Dunbeath Strath in Caithness, excavated over a period of almost a decade by the late Alex Morrison, with Ian Banks and Tony Pollard as the site managers. And I was on site for 2 years as an undergraduate student. And this is an incredibly complicated site that, for a whole range of reasons related to money and politics, has essentially not been written up or published. And the archive more or less all now survives in my room. I've managed to save it all and gather it together to hopefully bring it to publication at some point. It's an incredibly complicated site, as that plan from 1990, the early 1990s shows. And this photograph was taken by me from the photo tower in 1994. It's a bit fuzzy and out of focus. And the figure that's on the right there, for those of you who know him, is Tony Pollard in his early ponytail days. And this gives you a real sense of this being an unbelievably complicated site. It's a few miles up the Strath. It's well away from the coast, near the Dunbeath Water. But it's just got lots of stonework and lots of kind of concentric rings of stone and all sorts of stuff going on. An incredibly complicated Bronze Age monument, which we'll see in a moment perhaps eventually became almost a clava cairn type structure. Now, the phase of this that really interested me when I was looking through the archive, when I managed to get my hands on it, was aspects of the monument I hadn't really been aware of when I was there excavating as a student, which were essentially little standing stones. And here's a few pictures from the excavation archive of little standing stones. Again, you can see these are only about 1/2 metre high, and also lots and lots of stake holes, which were in lines that were set in radiating spoke-like arrangements. And this is a sketch plan that was produced, I think, by Tony and Ian back in the 1990s to try and give a sense of what they thought was happening with the phasing of Halmey. It started off with aard marks, which was the first thing I ever planned as an archaeologist. And then we have the second phase being the removal of the topsoil and the circle of mini-liths or little standing stones erected. And all of these standing stones had their long axis towards the centre of the circle, which is quite unusual for a stone circle, but reminded me a bit of the radiating arrangement we have of the multiple stone rows. And then we have this phase later on, which is a circle arrangement with a stone kerb and lots of timber stakes radiating out from a central open void. And this spoke-like arrangement is reminiscent of quite a lot of Bronze Age sites in Scotland, as I'll come back to, but again reminded me of the radiating plan of the multiple stone rows. Now, this site, we don't really know the dates exactly of everything. We know that the stone circle was dismantled in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, and it was therefore was constructed before that, but we don't know how far before that. But I suspect that more or less everything at this site is Bronze Age. So after running through lots of bits and pieces of evidence and some diverse series of sites, I want to sort of finish off by giving some thoughts about what these monuments were used for. What was the purpose of these sites in prehistory, and when were they built? Well, I guess the first thing I want to briefly talk about is the date of their construction. Now, these are sites that in the textbooks there's not really much consensus as to when they were constructed. Some would argue they are Neolithic monuments. Others would argue that they are of the Bronze Age. I personally think that they are monuments of the Bronze Age, and perhaps not even the early Bronze Age. I think that the beaker burials that they're sometimes associated with are earlier, and the rows themselves could belong to the 2nd millennium BC. But I don't have any dating evidence for that from Battle Moss, unfortunately, to back that up. And I think that's a really key research priority going forward, is to try and get some kind of definitive dates for these monuments. So, and I think that in general, there's actually a real paucity of late Neolithic monuments in Caithness. There's lots of stuff from the 4th millennium BC. There's lots of chambered tombs and so on, and then there's quite a lot of weird standing stone monuments and weird stone circles and horseshoe stone settings and those kind of things, which could well all be Bronze Age. And it may be that there actually is very little of the late Neolithic in Caithness, which is interesting when you think about what's happening in the late Neolithic in Orkney, just across the Pentland Firth, where there's an absolute explosion of stuff happening at the same time. And more fanciful moments, I do wonder whether at some point after 3000 BC, everyone who lived in Caithness got in a boat and then went over to Orkney to help them build Skara Brae and the Ring of Brodgar and all those monuments over there, and then came back again in the Bronze Age and did some beaker stuff. But that's probably a massive oversimplification. Anyway, we know that these are monuments that have got some kind of association with death, because, as Anderson pointed out all those decades ago, these are sites that are quite often found, not always, but quite often found in association with cairns, often radiating away from cairns, although the Hill of Many Stains is one exception to that. So they're monuments that seem to be around monuments of death. So at Upper Dounreay, there's a picture of me looking very Druitt next to one of the cairns at Upper Dounreay, which is presumably a burial cairn, but who knows, it may be related to field clearance and agriculture. The Gary Wynn stone rows a line on a beaker burial. And interestingly, when we were digging at the cairn at Battle Moss, I think that this stone that we found in amongst the rubble may have been a buried standing stone from one of the stone rows. That might be fanciful, but I think that there's something interesting going on here where they've taken a stone that could have been in a stone row and then deposited it as part of the cairn material. It doesn't have any structural element, because when we lifted that stone there was nothing underneath it, which again is quite typical of my career to date. Now, what does this mean then? These are the stones themselves are not burial monuments, but they are associated with burial monuments. I think that's the best way to express it. For me, the idea that really most sticks with me is something that I essentially borrowed from Colin Richards, who has done some amazing work in the last few years on Easter Island. And Colin has this very nice idea that all of the moa on Easter Island are located on roadways that go away from the quarries where these giant monoliths were quarried from. And he argued that essentially that through time, the further and further the moa got away from the quarry, the later they were in the construction sequence. And so the ones that are closest to the quarry are those that were built earlier, and the ones further away were built later. And he argued that therefore this was a kind of a stone genealogy. In other words, the closer you got to the quarry sites, the older the moa got. And it did make me wonder about these sites because of their wobbly appearance and how they seem to have almost organically grown in a linear direction, whether perhaps the same kind of thing's going on here as well. Perhaps we have these earlier burial monuments that are then added to with these stone rows. The stone rows are perhaps representative families or community groups. The individual standing stones perhaps are representing individual people. So whenever someone died in a community, a stone was erected in the correct row that was representative of that person. Hence, the rows are a wee bit wobbly and look as if they were maybe constructed piecemeal over a period of time. Now, this idea is it can't be proved, of course, but what I like about this idea is the fact that you then end up with something that's almost like a memorial garden, where you have a stone genealogy of a Bronze Age community, where as you walk back along the row towards the focal point of the monument, you're walking back in time. You can almost reel off the names of your ancestors as they go back further and further and further, with the stones representing your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and so on. And so what we have are monuments that are not monuments of death as such, but monuments of memorialization, and also a kind of a tangible way of representing a farming community. And this I think gives them, that for me, this personalizes the monuments in a way that's suggesting that they are these strange lunar extrapolation sites that are the plaything of shaman priests. For me, that leaves me cold. I think that what I like to imagine is that these are sites that were expanded through the kind of the careful erection of stones that were all about memorializing loved individuals who'd passed away. Anyway, that's what I like to think about the kind of one of the reasons these stones are being built. But there's also some other things going on here as well. They've got very interesting connections to the broader landscape. Some of them may be a bit more fanciful than others. Quite a few of the sites have got these slightly weird arrangements where they create strange visual effects on the horizon line. This is at Borgie Bridge, which is a very remote site in Sutherland. And looking to the south from the top of this set of stone rows, you can just about see there's a wee mountain just peeking over the top of this horizon line. And it almost looks like it's a cairn that's on the horizon line, but actually it's a mountain. It's just an optical illusion. And as you walk down the rows, that disappears. You can't see it anymore. And it made me wonder when I was there whether they were trying to give the effect that there was some kind of cairn on the horizon line aligned on by the stone. Although that, again, that might be my imagination going over time a bit too much. But certainly lots of these monuments are located in rocky places in the landscape, which is perhaps self-evident because they are rocky sites. But lots of them are near crags, rock shelters, overhanging rock outcrops, and so on, and suggesting that they're being created in the kind of in the most stony parts of the landscape. And some of them, these outcrops overlook the stones themselves. Perhaps they are the geological source of some of the stones, and certainly the suggestion that these outcropping locations are almost like kind of points where the underworld emerges into the world of the living. These are the points in the landscape where stone rows were deemed as being appropriate to construct. We know that probably these stones were being sourced fairly locally. This is another project that has to be done, I think, in terms of the sourcing of where the stones are coming from. Leslie Myatt identified a possible quarry site at Upper Dounreay, near the rows that are there. And certainly when you visit that site, you can kind of imagine how the rocks that are shaped exactly right for being multiple stone row stones are almost just popping out of the bedrock here. And it wouldn't take very much effort to pop some of these off and then take them to the nearby site. And this is Caithness flagstone, so this is the same kind of stuff that was being used to erect the stones of Stennis and the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney. I think it's also possible that that some of the stones at Battle Moss were being sourced from within the loch itself. There's lots of bedrock outcrops that are just under the water that look good candidates for being quarry sites, although that is a reservoir, so the water level has changed since prehistory. But again, this is something that we need to look at, because these outcrops might not just be a mystical place in the landscape that stone rows were built nearby, but might also have been literally the source of some of the stones themselves. And some of these stones are carefully chosen. I've no doubt about that because of their visual properties. So there's quite a lot of stones that have got quartz elements to them. At Gary Wynn, the stones have got white quartz, pink quartz, and are really nice and colourful stones. Very similar thing being found at Halmy, where there's curbstones that are of different colours of sandstone. So there's something going on in general, which is perhaps part of broader Bronze Age trends. And also, one of the things that's very characteristic at Battle Moss is that a lot of the stones are what I would describe as lozenge shaped, or they're pointy at the top. And this is one of the sets of what I called at the time stone row kits, where essentially you've got the standing stone itself and then the chalk or the packing stones arranged together there. And again, this could be fanciful, but a lot of these stones to me are the same size, the same shape as human torsos. And perhaps they were even dragged about as if you were maybe pulling it or dragging around a body, and had a slightly heavier but had a similar kind of feel to them. And so again, this made me think these are about individuals. These stones are being chosen because they represent specific people, because they look like bodies. They are people in a sense. Maybe I'm pushing this a bit too far here, who knows. Now, I mentioned already Learable Hill, where you've got this group of stone rows that are within a later prehistoric farming landscape. And it seems to me that these monuments are often very close to traces of agriculture and farming that are probably Bronze Age, perhaps later. So Learable Hill fulfills that criteria. The site at Loch Rimsdale has got a clearance cairn over one end of it. The site at Borgie Bridge has got a clearance cairn at one end, and it can brace. The site is literally in amongst a Bronze Age settlement. I mean, here, this picture, Andrew's standing literally in the middle of a Bronze Age roundhouse, which had been conveniently exposed by a fire probably a few weeks before we arrived. And you can see in this little OS map extract here that the stone rows are in amongst a landscape of occupation. And I do wonder whether these stone rows were actually literally being constructed and then expanded and being added to, even as people were living and farming in the same landscape. So while they seem to us to be incredibly remote sites and kept very far away from where anyone lives nowadays, I mean, you can see how remote Kinbrace is. That's the railway station near there is one of the most remote ones in Scotland. These are sites actually in the Bronze Age may well have been quite centrally located and may have been an everyday presence in people's lives. And so this, again, maybe reinforces the idea that these are memorial gardens that are used by local people, perhaps with a focus on some kind of ancestor who was in the earlier burial beaker burial in the area, or under a cairn or something like that. So, again, perhaps this turns on its head the idea these monuments were austere, shamanic places of archaeoastronomy. And the final point I want to make about how these sites fit in more broadly is, although they seem like weird outliers and they don't have any parallels in northern Britain, in fact, to me, they seem to have some shared characteristics with a series of monuments of the Bronze Age, many of which have been identified and revealed as being Bronze Age by Richard Bradley in a campaign of excavations in the 90s and 2000s. And here we have a series of sites that are essentially defined by having a radiating quality and having things that radiate out from a circular central point. So the classic examples of that are, for instance, Balnaarn of Clava and some of the Clava cairns. We have stone rays that were identified at Tom Naviri Recumbent Stone Circle in Aberdeenshire by Bradley. And we also have other sites which are reminiscent as well, thinking of like North Main's Barrow that was excavated by Gordon Barclay in the late 70s. And there, underneath the earthen barrow, he revealed a very complicated network of radiating stake holes, which essentially were a timber framework within which the mound was constructed around, and then those compartments within the mound were then used for burials, etc. And then also, this brings us back to that phase of the Halmy monument, where we have a circular space that's got radiating lines of stakes running out from it until it gets to a stone kerb. So these sites, all to me, they're not the same thing, but they seem to be sharing a shared architectural sensibility, and they all probably date to just the turn or into the first half of the second millennium BC. And this is what makes me think that perhaps the stone rows fit into this wider architectural tradition. There are many similarities. This is a very rough and ready little spreadsheet or table here, but some of the characteristics that are common to recumbent stone circles, clava-cairns, multiple stone rows, and many of the aspects of Halmy do make me wonder whether there's something interesting going on here in terms of connections being made between these sites, even if these features are almost hidden or invisible, or maybe secondary architectural elements of those monuments. Stone rows are almost like spoke-like arrangements. They just are not circular. They just only cover part of the 360-degree circuit, whereas other sites have got the full circle thing going on. So there is a connection here, I think, and I haven't really played out in my mind exactly how that works yet, but it does suggest to me that we should see the stone rows as part of these northern and northeastern Scottish Bronze Age traditions, rather than try and find connections to stone rows in places like Dartmoor or Brittany. There's maybe something else that's actually influencing the form of these monuments. So to sum up, from my perspective at this stage, and I guess I've still got some thinking to do about this, the multiple stone rows are not burial monuments. They're monuments of memorialization. I think that they help people remember their deceased loved ones, their ancestors, but also they offer a sort of a stone version of the family tree, essentially, that can be used to walk children through and teach them about their family history and all those kind of things that we think were probably important to people in prehistory. I think that they probably are Bronze Age in date, probably post-Beaker, maybe belonging to the first half of the second millennium BC, but perhaps being expanded and added to beyond that as well, perhaps even to the stage that people didn't even really know why they were adding to the stones anymore. I think that they're a part of broader architectural traditions of burial monuments in the northeast of Scotland and the north of Scotland, which have got connections with radiating settings and things like that, and perhaps also the careful and deliberate selection of interesting stones, and are very much monuments that belong to the rugged landscape of the far north. And I think there are monuments that probably existed near where people were living. They weren't far away or distant within the landscape. Perhaps they were even everyday visible presences for people to remind them of the community's past and how that community is constituted and organised. Now, I don't think by any means that this is the end of the story. There's lots more to done, and I don't think that me and some colleagues doing a few things 15 years ago have necessarily righted the wrongs of Tom's dominance of the literature for half a century. Certainly one of the things I have to do is I have to bring Battlemoss to publication, and that's something I'm hoping that I can do next year once I've finished all of my responsibilities to the SERF project in Perthshire. I'm working on a paper looking at Alexander Thom's methodology and the way we were able to disprove his ideas, specifically at Battlemoss through excavation. And also that Halmy has to be brought to publication as well, which is a completely different and difficult job, but something I'm quite committed to making happen at some point or another. There's a really fine assemblage, for instance, of Bronze Age flat rimware that's in a box in my office that I really could do with someone looking at. I think there's lots more field work that could be done here in terms of positively identifying quarry sites. Where are the standing stones coming from? Do we have similar things going on as been identified, for instance, by Colin Richards in Orkney and in the Western Isles about multiple different quarry sources for the same monument? Can we draw some conclusions about the places in the landscape the stones are coming from and the journeys that were taken from quarries to the monuments themselves? I think there's a lot of potential to try and get dates for these sites. I don't think we have to do massive amounts of excavation, but quite targeted excavations may turn up that lucky stone socket that's got something in it we can get a date from. or perhaps think about how we can maybe use other techniques to date these sites, for instance, looking at the relationship between the monuments and peat encroachment and how that might help us, or thinking about how we can maybe get dates from, for instance, the sediments and surfaces and quartzes and the stones and so on, in terms of the last times they were exposed to light, which would give us potentially rough dates, and it's something worth exploring. And I think also now, going back to where my interests lie more than they certainly did in 2003 to 5, I think that these are sites that much more could be done with to benefit the communities of people who live in Caithness and these parts of Sutherland. I think that that, for instance, working with the Caithness Broch project might allow us to bring some of these sites to a bit more prominence. You can imagine there being a bit of a stone row trail, which is a bit of an adjunct to the 500 road, where people could actually go and visit these sites and have a bit more information about them. And perhaps also they could be used for a bit more merchandising as well. I'm always looking for opportunities to make fridge magnets and T-shirts, and these sites lend themselves quite well to that as well, I think. So I think there's a lot of potential to do something with these unique sites, these really wonderful and amazing sites that are strangely compelling, because you've got hundreds of standing stones in the same bit of landscape, and yet their sites are almost unknown, which is something that I think is a wrong that has to be righted at some point in the future. And I certainly think that these stone rows could be working much harder for the people of Caithness, Sutherland, and the Highlands in general. So that's me really drawing to a conclusion now. There's lots of people to thank. I've mentioned most of them already. There was lots of funders and supporters of the project back in the day, and I dare say that some of these funders might have to think about doing a bit more supporting going forward to make the kind of publication of these projects and the next stages of fieldwork more of a reality. So at that point, I think I will finish and stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kenny. That was brilliant. Am I on now? I'm trying to think. First of all, before we go to, I've got quite a few questions coming in. I love the idea of a kind of monumental memorial garden kind of thing. It just, as you say, the sites they're extensive, but they're not like massively monumental. And your idea of walking through them was a lovely one, I think. I mean, do you think that, presumably there's enough stone there, do you think that if they wanted to make them bigger in the kind of Karnak style, then they absolutely could have, and they chose not to? They chose to keep them sort of body size or something.
Yeah, there are big standing stones in Caithness and Sutherland, and at Dounreay there's a nice big standing stone. At Learable Hill there's a big standing stone, and the raw materials and resources are definitely there in the area. But for some, Akavanish, the stone setting there's some really big megaliths. So I think it's a case of these being the right types of stones to make these sorts of monuments, and I think that perhaps part of this process is that they're relatively easy to move around and make. I mean, when we did the excavation, it was possible for one person to lift and move one of the standing stones, which gives them a bit of a sense of them being monuments that are maybe more intimate than your normal standing stone. Big standing stones, to move them, require ropes, rollers, big teams of people who are working to try and make it happen, whereas these little standing stones perhaps almost could be carried by an individual, or maybe even a mourner, to the site, and it gives a sort of an intimacy and privacy to the monument that I don't think is really evident in the traditional big standing stones that we normally recognise. So I think that this is a deliberate choice to use the little standing stones.
Yeah, it's a lovely touch. It's a shame they're going to disappear into the peat, but not all of them. Hopefully, some of them will still be there for a while to come. Now, who's you on top of the questions? Then, do you want to pass on one of the written questions, and then we can go to hands after that?
Yeah, that's fine. We've got a few questions come in. I think possibly a couple of them may have been answered as you carry on through the talks, but I'll ask the questions as they sort of came in. One of them, I think this came in. This was in after you started talking. You were talking about Helmy, possibly one of the other sites. Do you know if any of the stones have travelled a great distance? I think there's sort of a. You spoke a little bit about the size and perhaps different kinds of stones, but are you able to add any more to that?
Not in any detail, no. I mean, my sense is that the stones that are used for all these monuments are local, and have not come from very far away. The Watton and Gary Wynn sites, which are near one of my favourite sites, Kenny's Cairn, which is in a kind of little complex south of Yarrows. There's a few outcrops there that I'm pretty sure are the quarry sites where they came from, which are only 100 or 200 yards away. So I think that the majority of the sites, the stones are being sourced locally, but maybe from different local outcrops and different sources. They're in the right parts of the landscape. So while in prehistory you should never rule out anything, because people didn't always do things in easy and efficient ways. You know, using the principle of Occam's razor, I would imagine that they are coming from fairly nearby.
Okay, thank you for that one. Next question. Rather than memorialising dead people, could new joiners to a settlement have added a stone to signify their commitment?
That's a good idea. That's a nice idea. I don't see why not. I mean, I think that, you know, that the idea of this being a ceremony that the stones are perhaps representing a living person is a really compelling idea, and one I hadn't really considered, because that maybe has a whole different set of social obligations and responsibilities, and perhaps almost as a rite of passage, you know, that you become part of a new community. Or maybe when a young person went to adulthood, that's when a stone was erected in a row. So I think it could mark rites of passage, people entering or leaving communities, and they may have been as much for the living as the dead. So yeah, I think that's a really nice idea. So I definitely couldn't rule it out, because as with most of prehistory, you can't rule much in. You can rule some things out, but a lot of stuff you can't really rule in definitively. But that's a really lovely idea.
Mm-hmm.
We'll maybe have another written question, then we can go to hands as well, and maybe if anyone wants to ask in person. But
let's see. There seems to be a correlation with locations near water. Could you expand on that, perhaps?
Well, yes, there is definitely. I mean, they're on rivers, or coastal, or loch sides, and I think that actually, like, you know, the one at the Battle Moss site is very clearly got a kind of watery location, and in fact, from Battle Moss, I'm fairly sure, and I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure you can actually see the North Sea from Battle Moss as well, and the stone's quite carefully located so that that's the case, because it's quite a landscape where it's quite easy for the sea to disappear. So they're definitely looking at watery views, and I think that there's lots of connections in prehistory between stone and water. Perhaps it's something elemental. I mean, I think that probably in a prosaic way, it probably relates to these being places where people are living, because people tend to live near water, and also they're places that are routeways. And it's very clear that the rows are being situated along the straths that run north-south, in particular in Sutherland, and also the Strath of Kildonan, where you can cut across the whole of the country essentially. So I think that they're where people are moving, they're where people are living, and that's inevitably going to put them near water as well. And another connection I didn't really mention in the talk, but which is something which is also evident, is they're usually quite close to chambered cairns as well, often with the chambered cairns overlying them in the landscape. So there's also a sense that they have this connection to quite ancient places in the landscape of a human origin. So the sites they're very well situated for a whole range of logistical and symbolic connections to be made.
Thank you. I mean, if anyone wants to be brave and show your face, you can. There's a wee hand icon on the bar at the top. You can click on that if you've got a question, and you can ask your question in person. Otherwise, I think we've still got another question to ask. Where are we? Well, there's a question there about County Mayo. Are there parallels with County Mayo, Kenny? What do you think? Do you know the one that Seedfields monuments in County Mayo, or are they significantly different? That's a question from Anna Welch.
There's a big tradition of stone rows in rocky, kind of rugged landscapes across northwestern Europe. So you've got examples in Ireland. Indeed, there's examples in Dartmoor and Exmoor, and the Dartmoor ones are quite close parallels in some ways, although they have a different character in terms of their length and the size of the stones. And then there's also Brittany, which again is quite a rocky landscape when you visit it, and again a rugged coastal place. So I personally am not a great fan in making geographical connections that are suggesting that there's a cultural affiliation between these two places, but rather I like to think that there's kind of responses that people have to certain landscapes that often end up with the same kinds of outcomes. And there are landscapes that just seem to be stone row landscapes and just seem to be the place where those sorts of sites emerge, whereas they don't emerge in Fife, or somewhere like that. But that's not to say that at some point someone didn't travel and see a monument type and then think, oh, that's quite interesting, I might try and make one of them when I get back home, and then it suddenly starts to become a new tradition somewhere else. So I'd be cautious about saying that all these places that have got stone rows have got a cultural affiliation, but it's not impossible that there is some kind of relationship there, and it's not impossible that it may well be that this is people moving around and perhaps being inspired. But I think that these are sites that very much belong to their local landscape. They're kind of local monuments for local people, to coin a phrase. And I think that's really the way I would like to look at them, rather than being expressions of some wider European tradition.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we've got another question here, kind of about comparative dating rather than absolute dating. From Mike James, I think. Mike James. If this is a community memorial built up over time, is there any evidence that the stones have been put in at different times in different parts? So, maybe looking at the peat depth or anything, the style of the stones, or do you think you can compare? Are you thinking they were radiating from one end, or what can you say about that, if anything?
There's nothing really we can say in terms of for sure, because we don't have any dating evidence. There is a sense at some of the sites that there's a bit of grading, so the stones get smaller towards one end of the row, and it could well be that signifies that you start off with the bigger stones and the enthusiasm, and then things start to kind of peter out through time, or the bigger stones that are nearby start to run out and you end up with smaller stones. So that might give us a sense that there's a kind of a grading towards one end or the other. I'm fairly sure that the sites probably started growing outwards from the cairns and away from them, often in a sort of downhill alignment. But again, that's something that's difficult to really say for sure. And peat might be one way into that, absolutely. But it will be, unless the rows are really, the rows built up over maybe 4, 5, 6 generations, then it might be difficult to unpick that using radiocarbon dating. You'd have to be very lucky to get the dates that would help you answer that question. But it's certainly, of course, it begs the question: if these sites grew organically and were phased, which direction did they grow? And my suspicion is they grew away from the cairn, if there was a cairn, or they grew away from the narrow end of the fan towards the broader end of the fan. They essentially were kind of splaying out through time.
Yeah, that's good. And what about your peat knowledge specifically then? How much has the peat grown from the base of the stones then? How much had it grown in the sites that you excavated? And is that kind of generic over the whole of the Caithness, do you think, or is it varying? How much has the peat grown since the Bronze Age is the question.
I honestly don't. I mean, I have actually looked a lot of this up, and I did know this stuff once, but I mean, from memory, some of the sites there's 2 feet of peat or something like that. I mean, it's really, really thick, and most of it started to develop probably from the late Bronze Age onwards. So the idea would be that the rows were constructed, and then the peat started to accumulate maybe centuries after the sites were constructed. So the depth of peat varies at the sites. Bateaux-Moss, the peat wasn't that deep, maybe only about 10-15 centimeters, because it's a partially improved area, and it seems to not have had the same amount of accumulation. Whereas in the peat bog behind that site is very deep. Whereas at sites like Camster and Upper Doomray, which are actually in natural hollows, the peat's incredibly deep. But I don't think that necessarily means those sites don't date back to the same time. They're just different conditions for peat formation. But I think that there probably is something in using the peat to try and date these sites. But to be honest with you, I'm not clever enough to work it out. I'd need to actually ask someone who knows about peat, someone like Ben Geary or someone like that, who would be able to try and help make sense of that. And I'm sure there are people in Scotland who could help me with that as well. So that's something I definitely want to look at in terms of trying to use that as a proxy for dating the sites in some way.
Yeah. Do you think, or even in your Halmy archive that's somewhere under your table somewhere, but has there been any sort of paleo-environmental work carried out, or is that a candidate for something that needs to happen now? I mean, can you say at the moment what the vegetation was at the time of when they were in use? Or is that something that is on the wish list that needs funded?
Yeah, I mean, I I didn't do anything like that for Halmy because I didn't have really any money to do much of that kind of work. No, sorry, for Battle Moss, sorry. For Halmy, I've actually got no idea whether there was any environmental work, or I need to ask Tony and Ian whether there was anything like that done. Certainly, I mean, these are locations that kind of are absolutely begging for really good environmental work to be done, because they're perfect for cores and for getting good sequences and for trying to pick apart the vegetation and environment. So I think there's a lot more can be done in that respect, and certainly there may still be stuff lurking within the Halmy archives that might be usable for getting some kind of environmental data from it. But yeah, certainly it's something that is a bit of a missing gap in the knowledge so far, because obviously what the landscape looked like around these sites is fundamentally important. I mean, for my sense of more general Caithness environmental work from that bit of prehistory is the landscape was wooded but not densely wooded, as you might have found in parts further south in Scotland. And these sites might have been in kind of quite open landscapes, even in the Bronze Age.
I think that's answered most of the questions, so thanks very much for that. I mean, it's a lovely image. I think all these kind of missing people that we don't know about. Occasionally you'll get a burial here and a burial there, and if we're thinking about this in terms of there's your community, and even if it's the living community or the dead community, it's a lovely thing to think of, that people in that sort of quantity within the landscape and still there. So I'm going to say thank you. Normally we get a round of applause now, but I don't know how that's going to work like this, so I want to say thanks very much for opening our festival for us, and it was great to see you. Maybe one time we'll see you in person. So I don't know if everyone can wave your hands or whatever you want to do to say thanks to Kenny, and thanks very much again. The rest of you, if you want to feedback on the chat, then please do, and this will be, as I say, available on the Highland Archaeology Festival website as a recording in due course. So thank you very much. Bye now. Click on the leave button to leave, and yes, bye now.
Bye everyone, thank you.